MultiAsian.Church, Chapter 5. Next Generation Multi-Asian Churches. You've probably heard the saying, we've never done it that way before. Here's the thing, if we keep on doing the same things that we've been doing, but expect different results, that's just not going to happen. You have to do things differently to get different results. My first job after pastoring was working part-time at a family foundation. L² Foundation is a private foundation founded by Paul and Alice Chu with a mission to develop the leadership and legacy of Asian Americans for kingdom impact. The Chus have been blessed by the generosity of God and wanted to be a blessing to others. For 10 years, I was part of facilitating opportunities and gathering resources to catalyze next generation Asian American leaders. Highlights include these two books published by L² Foundation, Asian American Youth Ministry, and Conversations, Asian American Evangelical Theologies in Formation. From 2006 to 2009, I worked as a program director through a partnership formed between L² Foundation and Leadership Network. Leadership Network has a mission to work with innovative church leaders to multiply their impact in ministry. I got to be a part of developing what that would look like in an Asian American context. In other words, I was on point to identify the innovations among Asian American churches. What I have discovered is that there are growing numbers of new churches reaching the next generation of Asian Americans. Here's a picture showing this numerical growth over the past 15 years. Digging into the definition. The word next generation multi-Asian is a portmanteau. Next generation refers to the multiple generations of Asian Americans who are American-born, chronologically speaking, including the second generation or 2.0 in Korean American circles. Third generation, even fourth or fifth generations. This term also encompasses Asian Americans who are biracial, those who are children of parents with different ethnicities, whether that's two different Asian ethnicities, e.g. Korean married to Chinese, or someone with one Asian parent and one non-Asian parent, e.g. Caucasian, African American, or Latino American. When I talk with pastors who lead these next generation multi-Asian churches, I have found that a vast majority of these churches do not self-identify as Asian American churches, even though many of their congregations consist of over 80% Asian Americans. And to be fair, none of them would identify as being a multi-Asian church either. There are reasons for this non-identification. For one, the church may have a vision to just be a church without drawing any attention to its demographics. This thinking often comes from a theological premise that the gospel of Jesus Christ is for all people, citing Bible passages Galatians 3:28 or Revelation 7:9, and the church should be welcoming people of all ethnic backgrounds. Other churches will explicitly identify themselves as being a multi-ethnic church in order to express the intentionality to work at being diverse ethnically, racially, and for some, socioeconomically. There are other ways to describe multi-Asian. In sociological circles, other terms used to describe this demographic include Pan-Asian, Asian American, Asian Pacific Americans, APA, or Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. These terms don't adequately describe the multiple Asian ethnic groups coming together in an English-speaking church. In fact, Pan-Asian churches is a term that's currently used by some scholars and experts. I found these terms lacking because they should be inclusive of the non-Asians that were part of these churches and acknowledge the aspirations of these pastors towards becoming multi-ethnic churches. Third culture is a term used for Asian Americans with bicultural background. The term originated from third cultural kid, TCK, which was first coined by researchers John and Ruth Using in the 1950s. They used it to describe children of American citizens working and living abroad. These are children who were raised in a culture outside of their parents' culture, for a significant part of their developmental years. The TCK experience is unique in that these individuals move between cultures before fully forming their personal and cultural identity. While third culture describes well the fluidity of a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multiracial context that multi-Asian churches cultivate, it does not acknowledge the Asian American contribution to these multi-ethnic churches. Commonly used terms like third culture and multi-ethnic does not capture the importance of Asian Americans in these kinds of churches. This new wave of churches is a new thing which should be called out with a new term. In my conversation with pastors of multi-Asian churches, they seem to accept the term multi-Asian. They prefer this descriptive term more than Asian American. The final reason is that next generation multi-Asian churches would be considered as using a church plant model very different from an English ministry existing within an ethnic Asian church like those in a duplex, triplex, or townhouse models. See Chapter 4, Asian American Church Models. The word churches in the term next generation multi-Asian churches is precisely intended to note the autonomy and independence of these churches that are led and governed from an ethnic Asian church. When a church has its own governance with its own finances and its own constitution, it bears all of its own responsibilities and begins to shape its own distinct identity. It should be noted that not all church plants by Asian Americans are next generation multi-Asian churches. There are also a growing number of Asian language churches being planted to reach first generation Asian immigrants. In my own informal research, the estimated number of Asian American churches has grown 27% from 7,123 in 2007 to 9,075 in 2016. From a 2014 report, 1,787 Asian congregations are in the Southern Baptist Convention, up 54.3% from 1998 to 2013. Research findings. Going back to my story from the beginning of this chapter, during my time at L Squared Foundation and Leadership Network, I started my research by contacting Asian American churches and pastors, both informally through interviews and formally through a survey. The survey results were published in the 2007 report, Asian American Churches, an Introductory Survey. Here are 3 highlights from this report. Asian American churches are diversifying ethnically. 79% have at least 10% non-Asians in attendance. Active church planting to reach more people. 61% are planning to launch new churches. Missionary zeal is evident. 61% send out career missionaries. I also started compiling a list of Asian American church plants. I worked with the assumption that what we have in common as Asian American churches, amidst all of its diversity within cultures, languages, and generations, is Jesus Christ, the Bible, and the English language, albeit to varying degrees. Additionally, through that joint partnership between L Squared Foundation and Leadership Network, we hosted a handful of gatherings with next generation Asian American pastors to connect leaders with one another. One of the principles behind these gatherings is found in Proverbs 27:17. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. We brought these pastors together to sharpen one another through a process that facilitated results-based We brought these pastors together to sharpen one another through a process that facilitates result-based conversations. The list of Asian American church continues to grow in numbers, perhaps even exponentially. Time will tell. Initially, I had maintained the list through a wiki platform called WetPaint. By 2012, with over 200 churches, I migrated the list into an online spreadsheet to better manage this growing list. With that move, I coined the phrase next generation multi-Asian churches to describe this growing phenomena. Working with innovative church leaders at Leadership Network really energized me. I discovered that I had a knack for keeping an eye out for the new things that God is doing in and through his people. This definition of innovation was adapted from Peter Drucker. Innovation is change that creates a new level of performance. In the following chapters, we'll take a closer look at the characteristics and traits, including real-life stories of these next-generation multi-Asian churches.